We'll move to the next submission, which is an oral presentation by Ms. Jones, as outlined in CMD 18H 2.48 and 2.48A. Ms. Jones, floor is yours.
Thank you. Most of what I'm going to say is actually comments on what's been already discussed, and I'm not sure how much of what, nothing in my PowerPoint. I'm not using it, so sorry about that. So good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to make an oral presentation today. I'm a concerned citizen and property owner downstream of Chalk River Labs on Ile aux Allumettes, Quebec, and in the City of Ottawa. I have a Master of Health Science degree from the University of Toronto, during the training for which I learned, in no uncertain terms, that there is no safe dose of ionizing radiation. I am very concerned, therefore, about present and future radioactive releases and emissions, both intended and accidental, from the Chalk River site. The first comment I would like to make this afternoon is about the proposed 10-year term of the license for the Chalk River Laboratories. During this hearing, we have heard that a 10-year term would provide license certainty for the applicant and that it would reduce the burden on the CNSC staff, who noted this morning that a great deal of effort is involved in preparing for licensing hearings. We have not heard any explanation whatsoever as to how moving to a 10-year license term would be better for protecting health, safety, and the environment, which is CNSC's primary mandate under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. In terms of the proposed sweeping changes to the license and license conditions handbook, Commissioner McEwen, I'll spare you asking your question as to whether, after listening for 3 days, I am reassured about the rigor of the proposed license. The answer is no, I am not. A very large percentage of the so-called compliance verification criteria in the proposed CNL handbook are internal CNL documents. A request to CNSC for access to these referenced in these documents that are referenced in CNSC staff CMD 18H2 was refused. Previous interveners have discussed in detail the lack of transparency in this licensing process. I ask the Commission, why is the public denied access to these key licensing documents? Why should we trust the Commission and the licensee when they refuse access to documents that should be in the public domain? Why must interveners go through long and tedious access to information requests only to receive heavily redacted documents? Now that I have learned that the CSA Communities Portal does not work with Google Chrome, but does work with Internet Explorer, I have looked at the CSA waste standards. They are weak and lacking in detail. In several places, they merely advise the licensee to refer to CNSC guidance documents. This creates a circular loop with minimal content. CSA points to CNSC, CNSC points to CSA, and so forth. Although CNL is actively pursuing permanent waste disposal options at CRL and elsewhere, CSA standard N292.3 explicitly excludes permanent waste disposal. I quote, "This standard applies to waste organizations and facilities that generate, possess, manage, and transport low and intermediate level radioactive waste throughout the life cycle up to the point of disposal," unquote. None of the extensive standards and guidance developed in the past 13 years by the International Atomic Energy Agency for managing radioactive waste are referenced in the proposed license handbook. Nor is any of this international guidance adequately reflected in the CSA standards. The Government of Canada itself has not developed adequate laws, regulations, policies, and strategies for radioactive waste management, particularly disposal. Canada's radioactive waste policy framework has not been updated in more than 20 years. My colleague, Jeanette Charbonneau, at this hearing has asked why CNL and AECL have no plan to address intermediate level waste. Why does the Commission not address this matter in a substantive way? We want a plan and we want a date for the start of the siting process. Why has the Commission never acknowledged that 3 reactor cores have simply been dumped in the sand at CRL, the most irresponsible form of radioactive waste management imaginable? Why do CNSC and CNL have the hubris to claim repeatedly that all CRL waste is safely stored? Whatever your definition of safe storage, there is no way that dumping reactor cores conforms to any international standard. Even the weak CSA standard calls for containment of waste. I would like to point out that Canada is not universally viewed as a world leader at IAEA meetings. I have read some of the peer review reports from the International Joint Convention on the Safety of Radioactive Waste Management. Other IAEA member countries have repeatedly asked about Canada's failure to adopt a radioactive waste classification that would facilitate sound, long-term waste management. I would like to briefly speak about tritium contamination, a very serious problem that first got me into participating in these public hearings about 20 years ago when they were presided over by your predecessor, the Atomic Energy Control Board. Contamination of the CRL site with tritium, the radioactive form of hydrogen, is pervasive and widespread. Lakes, groundwater, trees, other plants and animals are contaminated with levels of tritium many times natural background. CRL workers breathe in carcinogenic tritium gases. Lakes throughout the site have up to 1,000 times natural tritium levels. Many interveners have expressed their concerns about water, the most vital substance on our living planet. Where tritium is released to the environment, as at CRL, the very water in our bodies becomes radioactively contaminated. Here in Pembroke, the local environment remains significantly contaminated with tritium from the operations of SRB Technologies, a tritium light factory which is located a mere few hundred meters from here in approximately that direction. Local citizens pleaded with CNSC for over a decade to take action to reduce the astronomically high radioactive tritium gas emissions from the SRB facility before CNSC staff finally issued an order that temporarily shut down SRB's processing operations and permanently shut down SRB's waste tube crushing rig, the source of most of the emissions. Now SRB regularly reports on its website data on tritium levels in its monitoring wells. This allows the public to watch the slow reduction in groundwater tritium contamination over time. Now that the NRU is closing and tritium contamination at CRL should show similar declines, CNSC should require CNL to make monthly tritium data for locations throughout the site publicly accessible on its website. SRB's waste tritium imports are an exception to CNL and CNSC staff's statements that radioactive waste shipments from foreign countries are not part of CNL's commercial waste operations. SRB imports waste exit signs, many of them not of its own manufacture, and ships them to CRL's commercial waste storage facility. Is it true that no foreign radioactive waste is coming to Chalk River? No, I think it is not true. I would like to comment on remarks you made, President Binder, yesterday evening during Mr. David Prentice's presentation. I would like to point out for the record that your views about the prowess and stellar international reputation of CNSC are not widely shared by people outside your organization. According to the Gélina Expert Panel on Environmental Assessment Reform, that reported to Minister McKenna last April, the CNSC is widely viewed as a captured regulator that is too close to the nuclear industry and promotes the projects that it is charged with regulating. According to the Environment Commissioner Julie Gelfand, who works in the Office of the Auditor General of Canada, CNSC was quite difficult to work with, was aggressive with auditors, and further that, quote, if you look at the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission's response, you will see that there is a kind of code. It says it agrees with our findings, but that it will continue on as before, and that it is doing everything correctly. Those quotes are from the Parliament of Canada website, report of the Standing Committee on Natural Resources entitled Nuclear Sector at the Crossroads from June 2017. According to the Nuclear Energy Insider, in promotional material for an upcoming international workshop on SMRs, Canada is a great place to come to develop SMRs because of its, quote, benign regulatory environment, unquote. Mr. Jamal of CNSC earlier this morning noted that he received a communication from a colleague in Europe who has been watching the proceedings here and was impressed with the public engagement. I would say, yes, the public engagement has been phenomenal here. I must commend CNSC for the intervener funding program and for the public hearing process whereby we can all come and contribute in person during licensing hearings. Unfortunately, in my experience and that of many others, the CNSC almost never acts upon the recommendations of interveners. There is a document on the website of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, correspondence between a member of the public and a CNSC staff member, that indicates CNSC has never refused to grant a license in its, I think that's supposed to be 17-year history. I sincerely hope that this time it will be different. I urge you to reflect the enormous contribution of citizens and First Nations to these public hearings in your decision. Please do not grant a 10-year license. Please extend the current license for a short period of time so that all of the substantive concerns presented here during this 3-day hearing can be addressed before considering any new license for the Chalk River Labs site.
Thank you. Question? Dr. Solomon?
On page 3 of the presentation, the intervener would like to ask the question of what is the status of the CPDP is, and if it is still the plan for Chalk River site, then why is the engineered mound for low-level waste not included in it? So there is an answer for that.
Kurt Keeler for the record. As stated previously in these proceedings, the CPDP is currently been drafted, the revision to it, and it is in review between AECL and CNL. Prior to getting it out, we expect to have it out hopefully this quarter.
Thank you. Question? Dr. McKeown?
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to paraphrase one of your questions and ask staff and CNL if they could answer it. So we've heard a lot during this hearing about the 10-year term. We've heard recommendations from, I think, renewing the license for a year or perhaps all the way up to a 5-year term. You asked a good question. What advantage does a 10-year term bring to the proponent or bring to the regulatory process over and above a 5-year term?
That wasn't the question I asked. I asked how does move to a 10-year license further the goal of protecting health, safety, and the environment, which is your primary mandate.
Okay, so forgive me, I thought that was implicit in what I'd said. But with that explicit statement, can you...
It's up to CNL, I think, to reply to that.
David Cox for the record. I would state that the length of our license does not change how we would comply with the safety and environmental requirements that we adhere to. Our programs are set up to produce results. We have programs that drive continuous improvement, and our track record through the current license period is showing significant improvement in a number of key areas. And that will remain in place no matter what the duration is for the license. I think we're proposing a 10-year license period because we're able to articulate a long-term vision. For a period of time, we have stable funding from AECL defined through that period of time, and we have a risk profile for the site. A set of planned activities, our licensed activities, will remain the same in our current license period relative to, our license activities will remain the same in the proposed future period relative to what they are now, aside from the reduction in risk that arises from shutdown of the NRU reactor and all of its associated activities. So we've got constancy in our activities. We've articulated a plan that goes forward for many years. For us, though, it's all about safety and reliability of our operations, meeting environmental requirements. I'll note that in our proposal, we will be undertaking and are proposing to undertake substantial environmental remediation activities that will further improve our environmental footprint for the Chalk River Laboratories. So, the length of the license doesn't change our ability to meet safety requirements. We have put forward, though, a 10-year plan, a 10-year vision of consistent licensed activities. And if there are changes, and our Commission member document, as presented, identifies certainly NSDF as a change, and we know there's a separate regulatory process underway for which there will be public engagement associated with that. The potential for small modular reactor, if that were to unfold, would likewise provide a detailed touch point for public engagement. And I'm hearing that if a 10-year license is granted, will be up for annual regulatory oversight review meetings, which will provide transparency and visibility on the outcome of our operations on an annual basis.
So the remediation activities that you're going to be undertaking, from the decommissioning of NRU to construction and deconstruction of buildings on the site, do any of those activities create short or medium-term increases in environmental risk or in potential risk to health as you're conducting them?
Kurt Keeler for the record. Those activities will not increase risk to environment and health. They'll actually decrease the risk to environment and health through the cleanup and the reduction of the risks associated with the old hazardous facilities on site.
So as you're cleaning up the old facilities, you can create some certainty that dust that could create risk or construction material that could create risk will be appropriately handled and monitored, and that the environment, for example, for dust, would also be protected?
That's correct. That's how we perform the work now, and that's how we'll perform similar work in the future for both decommissioning and remediation.
So piggybacking on that, and you have, you know what you're going to do, so you're going to put down lots of building. Where are you going to put them? What are you going to put? Are you going to keep it on site? Or you have a separate place to store them? I assume they're all temporary storage. So,
obviously, depending on the building, depends on the type of waste. We will, deactivate, decontaminate the buildings before demolition. So the goal is to get as much material released to a standard, off-site landfill for common building materials which are proven to be uncontaminated. That's our goal. Materials which are still contaminated will be stored appropriately on-site in interim storage. And we've looked at the volumes, and we've looked at our capacity for that interim storage, and we can do that with the waste management facilities we have now.
Thank you. Question? Dr. Demeter?
So, from CNSC staff point of view, this is a long-term 10 years. It's a complex operation if you look at the number of buildings and the number of activities. If there is no long-term solution for waste within the 10-year term, is there capacity on site to safely store all of the waste that they're going to contribute to with the demolition of these buildings and the change in their practice? Have you worked out that in the 10 years, without an alternate option, they can safely store all the waste they may produce in this proposed license term?
Well, I assume CNL should answer first.
Well, yeah, but I wanted to hear the safety.
They'll tell you if they agree with this or
Okay,
not.
sure.
We have looked at those as part of our integrated waste strategy, and we have capacity to take the waste on site that will be generated within this term.
So really, just so everybody understand, if the long-term solution, like near surface, does not get approved, what are you going to do with the waste for longer term on-site storage?
Continue to keep it in interim storage until a long-term disposal path has been determined and licensed,
As you've been doing in the past.
as we've been doing in the past.
Thank you. Staff?
Haiti Tatters for the record, and as per the compliance verification criteria for the waste management program articulates in their current license and license condition handbook. So they can't do the work if they don't have the space. That is the requirement and that is the criteria.
And the plan is that the CNSC office on site will continue working on site?
Haiti Tatters for the record, that is correct. We have a site office with our site inspectors who, as was described yesterday, have an inspection plan for the year, and that is based on the activities that have been identified and the programs that have been established, the programs that meet regulatory requirements, and the programs that are executed according to the licensee's commitment to executing those programs. So we hold them to count. And coming back to the 10-year term and why, from the regulator's perspective, we have no concern with the 10-year term. One, because current programs meet regulatory requirements. Current plans are in place that articulate what they will be doing. On a day-to-day basis, there are inspectors available to verify the activities that are being undertaken on site for the health and safety of persons and the environment. Again, as mentioned, that's an implicit statement in all of the regulatory framework. And thereby being able to report to the Commission through a 10-year license annually on the progress that they've made and the performance that they've made according to the programs that they've put in place.
Question? Mr. Silly?
Just have a question on this CPDP, so the plan that's being revised. It seems, of course, with the amount of remediation on the site, this is a very important plan. It's basically an integral part of the next 10 years. It's being revised and reviewed with AACL, I think, is what I'm hearing first, and then once agreement has been reached there, it would be then tabled with the regulator. Would this document also be made available to publics, or is it a confidential document?
Dave Cox for the record. Our current CPDP, which was published, I believe, in 2014, has been made available.
Well, my question is, will the new one be made available?
Yes, it would be.
Haiti Tatters for the record, an important point to note, according to the regulatory document on public information and disclosure, that document is being updated to ensure there is a regulatory requirement to provide to the public the environmental risk analysis as well as the PDP. So those documents will be required to be made available to the public according to the public information and disclosure program for the licensee.
And maybe just to clarify when that document will be available to the public.
Kurt Keeler for the record. I expect to issue it to the regulator at the end of this quarter. I don't know, can't speak to the internal review process at the regulator at that point in time.
Haiti Tadros for the record, just in terms of clarity, the document, Chairman Seeley, you're referring to is the Reg Doc or the CPDP?
CPDP, the plan.
CNL has, I believe, responded.
Question? Any more?
No, maybe just to clarify, so end of quarter one with ACL, so we can assume then it's quarter two for Publix?
That's a correct assumption.
Thanks.
Question? The intervener talked about dumping reactors core. That's the first time I hear about that thing. So somebody tell me, what does the intervener mean by that, and did it really happen?
Dave Cox for the record. We wouldn't use that terminology, but George Dolinar,
I'm just paraphrasing what you said.
Mr. George Dolinar can give us a description of how the cores are stored in the waste management areas.
George Dolinar for the record. Excuse me. It was referred to earlier, I believe earlier today, about the NRX accident that occurred in 1952. And the calandria from the NRX reactor is stored on site. It's stored in a waste management area called Waste Management Area A. It's buried below surface, but if you're familiar with Waste Management Area A, there is a mound sort of central in that particular facility, and it's below that mounded earth where the reactor core is stored. We have two other calandrias stored in Waste Management Area B. Following the NRX accident in 1952, it took about a year to, actually 14 months to return NRX to service. And most of the materials that were removed from NRX were stored in Waste Management Area A. And this allowed Chalk River Labs to transfer its waste management activities to Waste Management Area B, which continues to operate today, and this is where two other reactor cores are stored.
Maybe, what did you mean, what was your concern with, you used the word dump those core. What did you mean by that precisely?
I think the term stored is being used kind of loosely here. I don't think they're in containers. I think they're just buried in the sand. So if you call that storage, I'm not sure that that would conform to any international guidelines on how those things should be carefully taken care of.
Well, do you want to reply to this?
George Dolinar for the record. The NRX calandria, which is stored in Waste Management Area A, was removed from the reactor. It was wrapped and put into, in those days, some wooden structure to enable its transfer to Waste Management Area A. It was moved down a ramp that was prepared for the transport vehicles that were moving it to that facility. And the reactor calandria was removed from, or the tractor was removed from the transport trailer and the ensuing structure, and that was buried in the soil. I should mention that we monitor these waste management areas quite extensively. There's virtually no, specific contamination coming from the three cores that I've mentioned. There was an initial, I guess for full clarity, there was an initial sort of rinse function associated with emplacing these in the soil. So what we saw was tritium move away. That would have happened within a few years after emplacement. But most of the contamination associated with the calandria, for example, is activation, so it's part of the metal material. So it largely remains near the actual calandria or part of the calandria, and we don't see any transport outside of Waste Management Area A of contaminants from the NRX calandria, for example.
So what is the long-term end of, solution for that particular part? Is that a high level, intermediate? What's the long-term plan or hope for this end of decommissioning?
Kurt Keeler for the record. Long-term would be the extraction of those cores and repackaging into a different waste form, likely intermediate waste, depending on the actual characterization at the time, to then put them in, hopefully someday, a permanent disposal facility.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? Final word.
Thank you. I would like to say that I feel very strongly that at this point, were the CNSC to approve a 10-year license for the Chalk River Laboratories, they would be confirming to the many people now watching this process that CNSC is a captured regulator and that Canada urgently needs to reform its nuclear governance system to ensure responsible management of radioactive waste. And I would also like to acknowledge the incredible contribution of so many interveners who spent many, many hours, most of it unpaid, to bring you their thoughtful and helpful comments and suggestions in hopes of influencing your decision. Please don't let them down.
Thank you.